thank you. Thank you all for coming. So it sounds like a strange thing to say in such a grim time, but we're going to try to have some fun tonight because I think I'm not the only one who looks back at that period in our national life as depressing as it could be when it was happening, but as good by comparison. And we're going to get into those comparisons between Nixon and Trump and some of what's going on in American journalism. But I wanted to first just say what an honor it is for me to be with Carl and Bob. I graduated from high school in 1975, and basically my whole life was determined by my reverence for these two and what they were accomplishing when I was in high school, and that set me on a course of my career. So just wanted to say that. Before we talk about Watergate, Carl, you are a journalist and also a Jew. So how hard has it been for you in the last couple of weeks to process all of this and keep your journalistic detachment?
I thought you were asking him. Let me start over again. You can't hear me with just a lapel mic? I think you're good. We're good. Can you hear me? Okay. No, okay, I'm going to use it. So I'm going to use this. And also I have one request. Could you turn the house lights down a little bit, and then we could see y'all, and we can have a little bit more of a dialogue.
Take the house lights up a little bit so we can see
down,
y'all.
consider not quite so bright in our eyes, and we can see
All right.
who we're speaking with. And let me also say how happy I am to be here. I spent part of my youth here working at the Elizabeth Daily Journal next door. Age 21 to 22 until I went to the Washington Post. And thank you for that question. I'm a secular Jew, and very much I identify my Jewishness as a wonderful, wonderful thing. I always have. And I've covered the '82 war, which Israel went up through Lebanon, and the consequences of that war we're still dealing with today, as with other wars. And so, as a Jew, I'm sometimes dismayed by some of what I see, and at the same time, Israel, it seems to me, is something that all Jews should take great pride in, and it has an importance to the Jewish people that is deep and abiding, and I feel that. I think you were mentioning earlier, I wrote a memoir about my family. I grew up in a left-wing family, but again, secular Jews. And the FBI came to my bar mitzvah to take down license tag numbers. But I think it's important as a journalist, particularly, to talk about some realities that often the American press doesn't get. One of which is that Likud is not Israel. The Likud party, Netanyahu, they are part of a coalition that has governed Israel for 15 years with Netanyahu there, others before him. But I think there is a misconception, especially among American Jews, as to equate Likud, Netanyahu, with the state of Israel as if it were one and the same. I think there is, repertorially speaking, a division in Israel, in some ways similar to the divisions that we see in this country, between left, right, center. And I think it's important, though, to look at what the Likud governments in succession have done, especially in terms of Palestine as it's seen by Palestinians. And I believe, as a Jew, and I would say repertorially from what I have seen in my trips to Israel, in my dealings with diplomats from Israel, from Jordan, from other Middle Eastern countries, that both as a Jew and as a reporter, there is a logic and a inevitability, or should be, to a two-state solution in this part of the world, in which there is a Palestinian state and in which there is a state of Israel, and where that Palestinian state should be and how it should be administered is something that Likud and Netanyahu have worked very hard to prevent.
Well, we can,
I'm going to leave it at that.
yeah, we can hope that at least a little bit of good news that comes out of this is that he doesn't really have much of a political future in Israel, nor does his power grab over the courts. So the future of Israeli democracy is actually looking pretty good. Bob, you have covered Trump. I think you spent more time with Trump in the White House than any other reporter, my understanding. Certainly, in researching your books.
And on the phone.
And on the phone, in the Trump tapes. So you...
I mean, imagine this world, the last year of the Trump presidency, agreed to do these interviews. He could call anytime, I could call anytime.
I can't get you on the phone because you're talking about Trump.
I'd say, hang on.
Your wife got tired of him calling us.
Yeah. And it was an interesting experience for a reporter because he was the president and the sitting president, and so our phone would ring. And we would think, is it one of our daughters? Or is it a friend? Is it a robocall? Or is it Donald Trump? And it would often be Donald Trump. And so it's a very interesting experience for a reporter to have that kind of phone relationship. The problem is, in the Trump tapes where all of these are out, it shows, and this is not a political judgment, this is an empirical one out of his own mouth, that he was so irresponsible in responding to the coronavirus. Took me months to find out, but he got a very specific warning from the people who knew the most, and he lied and covered up. And in July, so 4 months before the re-election, I called him up and I said, well, things are pretty bad, aren't they? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, the virus. And he said, it's under control. And I said, at that point, 140,000 people had died in our country, his country, that he was president. And he knew and he could have issued a warning. And I just kept asking, what's the plan? And he said, if I said it now, no one would remember. When is he on? And I said, come on, this is bad, and you have lost control of this, and you haven't done what he said the job of the president is to protect the people. And he said, well, I'll have a plan in 106 days. And I said, what's he? Turned out that was election day. He only cared about election and himself. tragically for not just him and the Republican Party, but for the 140,000 who died at that point. Now we've hit 1.1 million, and couldn't have stopped it all, but that he could have communicated the truth and said, you know, this is what I've been told.
What do you think the odds are he'll get reelected?
Too high. And you know what? See, his 4 years as president are training wheels for him. And if he becomes president again, he's learned where the levers of power are. You come and, you know, interview for Secretary of Defense or any job, and he's figuratively not literally get down on your knees. I want an oath of total loyalty and do what I say. No independence.
And retribution as his watchword.
You know, if you come after me, I come after you, but he still comes after, and he's disconnected from the basic premise of democracy and why he doesn't like it. Democracy is about other people, and he only cares and focuses on himself. And so, democracy is very threatening.
Carl, would the Watergate story even be possible to report today? Wouldn't Fox, you know, just put up a chyron that said assault on the presidency, and half the country would absorb any of what you reported?
I think it's definitely could be reportable today, would be reportable today. I think we've had great reporting on Donald Trump, on his presidency, not just books by Bob, by reporters covering the White House. I think it's probably the greatest White House reporting by a good deal of the Washington press corps of any presidency in my lifetime. I think your question implies something else, and that is, what would the result be? And the result might be quite different. It might go up in the ether. Why would I answer it that way? Well, we have a different country today. We have people increasingly in this country who are looking for news and information for the purpose of reinforcing what they already believe. Woodward and I have used the phrase now for half a century. Early on, we were asked, well, what is it, this kind of reporting you guys are doing? And we came up with this idea of calling it the best obtainable version of the truth. And I think there is far less interest in the best obtainable version of the truth today. There's also a corollary to that, and that is that the truth is not neutral. I think, you know, look at a lynching. A lynching is not neutral. And we've been yoked by this idea in the press that our job is to give 50% of the story to one side and what they're saying, 50% to the other, and be done with it. And indeed, what the most important thing a journalist, a reporter, a news editor does in many regards is to decide what is news. And we made a decision at the Washington Post that this was news, that what we were reporting was news.
And we would write a story and say, there's this massive campaign of sabotage and espionage that Nixon and his people are behind, aimed at the Democrats, and then we'd call the White House and say, what do you think? And they'd say, oh, a bunch of lies and untrue. And then we'd give them their paragraph, and then we'd
Exactly. It was not 50%. Recently in CNN, you've seen this whole pronouncement that was made by the new owners of CNN and Malone.
Be careful, you still work for them.
They're not headed in a better direction.
Oh, absolutely, and I think CNN is back on track from everything I can see.
No, it's not just saying that. It's the
dictionary,
News
raise
sheet
your
at
hand.
CNN was better.
So, but let's talk about what happened in Watergate. Maybe we'll set the table for
Yeah.
some other things tonight. What happened in Watergate was a criminal president of the United States who established this campaign, this huge, vast campaign of political espionage and sabotage to undermine the very basis of American democracy, the electoral system. Sound familiar? Yes. And so what happened? The press did its job. Washington Post, we obviously were early on out in front of this story. New York Times, Cy Hurst, and other great reporters at the Times then started doing this story. Time magazine, the press did its job to the point where the American people could not ignore the facts in front of them. And gradually Nixon, who maintained a very, very high favorability polling up until the discovery of his tapes and the Saturday Night Massacre. How many people here know about the Saturday Night Massacre? The anniversary was Saturday in Woodward.
Those are old people.
And so the press did its job, and then, because of what was appearing in the press, a Senate investigating committee headed by Sam Ervin, the senator from North Carolina, undertook a historic investigation that produced a record of Nixon's crimes. It not only disclosed the tapes that he had taped himself and what was on those tapes, but then Nixon was, the articles of impeachment were voted against Nixon by the House Judiciary Committee, and the key votes in those articles of impeachment were cast by Republicans. It became a bipartisan consensus that this was a criminal president of the United States, unlike what we have seen in the Trump
And
example.
then Republican senators went to the.
Well, exactly. And
Yes.
Bob will tell you a really interesting.
So after Nixon resigned, Barry Goldwater, the conscience of the Republican Party, and the Senate leader Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, John Rhodes, House leader from Arizona, were called to see Nixon. And this is August 7th, 1974. The smoking gun tape is out. Nixon knows he's in trouble. So Goldwater agreed that you and I come up and he would read his daily diary from this. So we get there and he gave us
This is
wisdom.
for the final. This is
little
for the
glass of
final.
booze of scotch about like that.
This is when you were reporting the final days.
Yes, so he gets out his daily diary, which he dictates. And so this August 7th, he goes to see Nixon with John Rhodes and Hugh Scott. And Nixon had no lawyer, no aide there. He knows he's going to be impeached. And so he's trying to figure out what might happen in the Senate trial. Now, he would need 34 votes to stay in office because 67, 2/3, according to the Constitution, would remove him. And so Nixon's kind of uncomfortably, how do you think I'm going to do in the Senate? And Rhodes and Scott say, we've asked Goldwater to be our spokesperson. And Goldwater kind of leans back and says, Mr. President, I've counted Democrats and Republicans. You have 5 votes, and one of them is not mine. One of the most important moments in presidential history where a president's own party rose up and said, too many crimes, too many lies, we're not going to go along with this. The next night, Nixon announced he was resigning.
So Carl, you had a story about today's Senate that you broke on CNN. and which has now been basically confirmed in the new book about Mitt Romney, in which he reported that most of the Senate Republican members of the Senate, despise Trump, think that he's a menace to the Republic, but they apparently don't have the courage to do what Barry Goldwater did, is that right?
And then some. What the story I did, look, I've been covering this, on the air for 4 years. Actually, the story was after 3 years or so. And I had heard from all of these Republican senators who would take it over in the corner and tell you how they despised him and how they were afraid of him and one thing and another. And always they said it's got to be off the record. But I also had talked to their aides. And the aides were even more adamant about what their bosses felt. And so I finally decided, there's no agreement with my sources, meaning these aides, that I'm bound by confidentiality. I'm going to do the story. And so I did it, and I named 21 Republican senators who held Trump in contempt, disdain, hoped somehow
And this
that he
was,
would be...
what, 18 months ago?
This was 18, this is in the third or beginning of the fourth year of his presidency. And there was one, I believe, denial to the story. I named every one of them. There may have been one denial or two, or one, and he was lying. And the next day I got a call from a former Republican senator who had served very recently, who said, Carl, the number is really close to 40 of the Republican senators. So here's what we've been dealing with, and we see it now. Of course, Romney in the book goes that way. He was one of them, except he's the one who spoke out. And then let's compare that to what happened in Watergate. We had these courageous senators, first on the Senate Watergate Committee, who, one of them, Howard Baker, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Republican, Tennessee. He said that, and when he was saying that, he didn't know the answer, because he was actually a secret emissary back to the Nixon White House. He was a stooge. Very little known until we did the Final Days book, but he got the facts with this there have been 3 great congressional investigations in my lifetime. The Army McCarthy hearings, the Senate Watergate Committee hearings, and the Cheney-led January 6th hearings. And so let's look and so the great difference in the legislative branch today is, unlike in Watergate, these senators, and look at the House, which is really an extension, the House Republicans, an extension of MAGA. That's what we're dealing with here today. But I want to say one last thing about, and we can talk about it later, and that is, we can't just look at somehow the Congress of the United States, our political institutions, our journalistic institutions, without talking about the country itself. We've had a cold civil war in this country for 30, 35 years. Trump ignited it. No question about that. Repertorially, Bob has done it, I've done it, other reporters have done it. He ignited this cold civil war. But we need to be reporting also on the people of this country, because it's not happening in a vacuum in Washington. This is about half the country, just about, voted for Donald Trump. 70% of the people who identify themselves as Republicans still go along with what he says. So I think we need a different approach, perhaps, to say, oh, it's just these guys in the Congress of the United States.
So, go ahead. You want to say something? So, just to kind of go to the anniversaries of the book, which is this coming February, it'll be 50 years since the publication of All the President's Men. And I read it, and I recommend all of you do too, because it's still a great book. Even though we now know a lot more, it's just a great story that they tell really well in this book, and then they do it again in the Final Days which depicts.
Sitting here thinking, we were 30 years old then.
Yes. 30 years old. And Len Downey, who was the boss at the Washington Post after Ben Bradley, said that he wrote that you two actually didn't get along very well for various parts.
For 50 years.
If you get on the telephone, it'd be a lot easier.
So, I mean, you know, you look to outsiders as like a Mutt and Jeff, everybody, including you guys, accept that Carl is the superior writer and Bob is the superior reporter. So there wasn't a lot of confusion about that. But there were other things
That's
in the
confusing.
midst. You agree with that?
One of the wonderful things, look, you can see the two of us, we're kind of joined at the hip after 50 years. And one of the amazing things about the relationship is that we switch very often, then and now, the expected roles. He can write a sentence that'll knock your socks off. You know,
But not a paragraph. You raised all the president's men, the origin of it. We've kind of talked about, but what's interesting, it was Carl's idea to write the book, and we were going to write it about what Nixon and John Mitchell and Haldeman did. And he had somebody who was an agent, so we decided we were going to work on that book. We wrote some chapters, but Watergate was unspooling so fast, we couldn't keep up with it. And I said, you know, what we're going to have to do is follow the first rule of journalism. Write about what you know, and we know our own experience. Let's write it this way. You thought it was going to be a big ego trip, and it couldn't be. And so I drafted some chapters, and we looked at it, and we said, you know, as long as we tell the truth about our mistakes, the basic lesson of the Nixon presidency is he would never come clean. And so in the book, when we made mistakes, when there were jokes, when there were things, we put them all in the book.
You talked about how you tried to get grand jurors to talk, and that was a mistake.
Yeah, it might have been a mistake, maybe not.
I still want to see if there's a law against it. I don't think there is.
So, but just as Gene Roberts, who John quoted earlier, saying this was the greatest reportorial feat ever. And when you read the book, you really see that. And your ability to, Carl, at one point you knock on the door of a bookkeeper and you talk your way into the house with a cigarette. I don't know what you did, but it was just, how do you do that nowadays? You can't even call up sources.
You do the same thing is what I started to answer this actually earlier, and as usual went off in my circumlocucious way. Look, we have today Google, all kinds of tools that are so great that Woodward and I didn't have back then to help get us out there and do what we need to do, which is to knock on the doors. You look at the movie of All the President's Men, and what do you see? You see these two young guys who are knocking on doors, not of Democrats, every source we had, every major source, and I think really all of our sources were Republicans, and most of them had worked for or supported Richard Nixon.
Movie version, Dustin Hoffman
Yes.
playing Carl. And if you saw the movie, or you can imagine it, I mean, no one ever looked more needy. You know, I mean, it's a reality. Sometimes, you know, you used to be able to get dates because of sympathy.
Tough customer.
Yeah, that needy look. No? You don't think you
I don't
look
go in with a
needy?
mirror. Yeah, media, and I need to know what the hell happened. So Ms. Bookkeeper, tell me what the hell happened. And what do I do for that? I knock on the door, there's reluctance for me to come inside, and I said, oh, I'm just gonna comfort out. We heard, Madam Bookkeeper, that you were very uncomfortable with some things you had seen. And really, what is it we're looking for? People respond when you're looking for the best obtainable version of the truth. Not all of them, but if you're straightforward and you're a good listener, I think our experience shows this basic methodology, even today, is still how we get the information as reporters, as you see in that.
But Carl, this I mean, need to say, this
Go back to
Carl's idea. Got a list of the people who worked on the Nixon committee, and this is 1972. This is 51 years ago, and you're looking at saying these people will not talk in the office.
That's right.
We're going to have to go find out where they lived, and you could even do that before Google. And we're going to go knock on doors. And it's such an important lesson. May I advance a little bit to applying the Bernstein approach? When I was working on one of the George Bush books, there was a general who would not talk to me. And I sent messages, intermediaries, emails, phone calls, and I found out where he lived. And I went, knocked on his door. Now, when is the best time to go knock on the door of a four-star dinner? Would you go?
You guys often did it late at night, or very early in the morning before they left for work. I don't know.
No. The best time to go is 8:17 on a Tuesday.
It's true.
It's true. I mean, 8:15, they will have eaten dinner if they're home and so forth. You're going to the general's house, and so you want to wear a coat and tie and look, and you want to look.
No white shoes.
No, that's not. That you would be.
You're out of here, boy.
So I knocked on his door. Now this was as emphatic a no as you can get. And he opened the door. He looked at me and he said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And from the CIA, they have some good, let the silence suck out the truth. So no facial expression. I didn't say anything. And he just looked at me. And he went, "Come on in." Sat for 2 hours, like the bookkeeper with Carl, and helped me. And I was able to come back many nights. One of the best sources I ever had developed. Now, it started out as an emphatic no, transited to a very emphatic yes. Why? Because somebody showed up. We're not showing up. Reporters are sitting around in their desks doing something. These are young reporters here, nodding. They have to do 5 stories, and they are at their desk and their telephone. And so in the White House, you have a story and you call in and say, "We want a response," and 3 deputy press secretaries sit around the computer and say, "Okay, here's going to be our response. How can we respond without saying anything?"
You pick up on something here about the White House response, and maybe one of the first hugely important story that we wrote that put the Watergate undercover activities by Nixon's re-election committee into the White House. And that was largely from this bookkeeper, and then 4 other people who knew about the secret fund that paid for the undercover activities. And one of them was John N. Mitchell, the former Attorney General of the United States, Nixon's former law partner, and his campaign manager. And we had learned he controlled this secret fund. And so we did a story, said John N. Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund that paid for these activities. Ben Bradley, our great editor, who maybe we'll speak about a little bit tonight, came to Woodward me and said, you guys really, you got this nailed down every way. I'm not going to ask you who your sources are, but you've got to have multiple sources on this. You got it? He said, yes. He said, look, there's never been a story like this before. You are about to say that the former Attorney General of the United States is a crook. A man as close to Richard Nixon as there has been.
And he said, and you better be right.
So we did the story, and I called the White House that night, got a deputy press secretary, and I read him the story, and he said, okay, very calmly, let me get back to you on that with our response. So he calls me back, and he says, okay, here's our response. The sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. I typed it out, and I said, yes. He said, that's it. I said, wait a minute. Aside from this geyser that you think is going off in our backyard, is the story accurate? Did Mr. Mitchell control those funds? Were there such funds? The sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation, he repeated. And by then, we had come to call this the non-denial denial. And try and make our conduct the issue in Watergate rather than the conduct of the president, and in this case, his men. And so I had a phone number for John Mitchell in New York where I thought I could reach him. I called him up, he answered the phone, and I said, Mr. Mitchell, I have a story that we're putting in the Washington Post tomorrow. I'd like to read it to you and have your response. He said, yeah, go ahead. So I read him, John A. Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States controlled a secret fund, and he goes, Jesus.
You called it like 11:30 at night,
Yes,
right? But
yeah.
what's amazing is nowadays the chances of getting through to any of these people.
Well, it helped that he drank. It's a little bit on the sauce that night. So I then continued, and I said, Johnny Mitchell, Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund that paid for undercover activities. Jesus, he said. I got to the end of the first paragraph, by which time the story was unmistakable what it said, and there was a pause, and he said, Jesus Christ, all that crap, you're putting that in the paper. If you print that, Katie Graham, referring to the great publisher of the Washington Post, Katharine Graham, is going to get her tit caught in a big fat rigor. I kind of instinctively jumped back from the phone, more worried about my parts than Mrs. Graham's. I wasn't used to talking to attorneys general, I guess. And then he said the most chilling words in 65 years that I've been, 64 years reporting. He said, and when this campaign is over, we're going to do a little story on YouTube, boys. And he hung up the phone. And the threat was real. Threat, I don't know exactly what he meant, except it was indicative of his attitude and the Nixon White House attitude toward a free press, whether he was talking about bodily harm, whether he was talking about trying to take away the television licenses of the Washington Post Company, the financial lifeblood, which they tried to do. I don't know. So I called Ben Bradley at home, the editor of the Post, and I told him what Mitchell had said. And he said, "You really said that about Catherine?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "All right, put it all on the paper, but leave out her tip." Next morning, Mrs. Graham came up to me and said, "Carl, do you have any more messages for me?"
So I worked for Mrs. Graham for 28 years. These guys worked for her for a long time. And just so you know, since Bob mentioned movies, Meryl Streep in the movie The Paper is Catherine Graham. She totally inhabits her the way Jason Robards does Ben Bradley. Not quite sure I could say the same thing about Robert Redford and you.
I didn't say that.
But I do want to...
have no idea how many women are disappointed. I have seen disappointment. During this period, I could get a date with anyone on the telephone. And then I'd call and, "Oh yeah, I'd love to, oh yeah, here's my address." And then I'd go,
You didn't even have to knock on the door.
yeah, I'd go to, on the front, and then, I I've seen disappointment. There's a lot of disappointed people. Yeah, but I've been.
I wanted you to pull out the thing that, because Carl was talking about Nixon's attitude toward the press, and you carry something around with you from the tapes.
Yes,
It's
yes,
very much on
I do. I would like to read that, but before, because we brought up Mrs. Graham,
Yeah.
it's really important what kind of leader she was. And after Nixon resigned, she wrote Carl and myself personal letter, but she had more stationery than any 500 people in Washington. She wrote on a yellow legal note, "Dear Carl and I, you did some of the stories on Nixon, he's now gone. Quote, now don't start thinking too highly of yourself. And let me give you some advice." She said, "My advice is beware of the demon pomposity. Beware of the demon pomposity." So true in journalism, Wall Street, politics, Hollywood. We are a country in many ways infected with pomposity. And pomposity is a smugness and self-satisfaction. And you can't do journalism like we try to do. And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. But you can't feel smug or self-satisfied because you don't know everything. Bradley used to say, we're doing the Watergate story, and he said, you go home and there's a lump in your stomach because you have good sources, you believe, but you can't prove it, you don't have audio, you don't have video. So you were necessarily swimming in a sea of doubt, and you need to know that and live by it. I'll read Nixon.
Before you do, I just want to tell people about Katharine Graham's memoir, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It's called Personal History, and I would recommend it to people. I think it pains all three of us that our proprietor, mine at Newsweek, is not as maybe remembered 20 years after her death by as many Americans as she should be. She was the first woman to run a Fortune 500 company, and among many other achievements, was basically the towering figure of Washington for 40 years.
And she was tough, and that toughness, and beware of the demon pomposity is what. So this is from the Nixon tapes. It's December 14th, 1972, after he's won his giant re-election. And sabotage, espionage, it worked. He won 49 states. So he's in the Oval Office alone with Henry Kissinger. And this is what comes in, because this is a moment of triumph and exuberance for Nixon. And this is what he's recorded saying to Kissinger. He said, remember what we're going to be around and outlive our enemies. And also never forget the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that on a blackboard 100 times and never forget it. That's Nixon speaking from head and heart. That's Donald Trump also. Donald Trump could have said that 50 years later.
So that brings us to something that you have in your introduction to the new edition of All the President's Men, and that is a really cogent description of what Watergate meant, what it was about in a larger sense. You know, obviously it wasn't a third-rate burglary as Nixon's press secretary called it, and the cover-up wasn't worse than the crime. You guys have demolished that pretty well, but the question is what it was, and you describe it, the two of you describe it as 5 different wars, and I think we've already covered the war against the news media, which also on the tapes has a distinctly anti-Semitic quality. Nixon rages against Jews in the press. But there was also, Carl, a war against the anti-war movement. What was that about?
Well, at the height of the anti-war movement, Nixon set out to destroy the anti-war movement through another campaign of espionage and sabotage. The so-called COINTELPRO undertaking at the FBI was one thing involving breaking in to people's homes, but Nixon ordered a whole series of actions against the anti-war movement, including what was called the Houston Plan. The Houston Plan, which John Dean testified about this, the Houston Plan gave presidential approval to the idea that there could be a inside house investigative team that would do break-ins in the name of national security to find out what not just the anti-war movement was doing, but also some people in the press.
And Nixon was ordering some of these break-ins. He didn't order the Watergate break-in.
Now,
He didn't order other break-ins.
He
right?
did. 1 year, almost to the day, before the Watergate break-in, there was an institution in Washington, a think tank called the Brookings Institution. And the Nixon investigatory mafia had learned that in a safe at Brookings were some papers related to the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson that Nixon believed would show that Johnson had been much more dishonest about the war in Vietnam than he, Nixon, had been accused of by the anti-war movement. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. And Nixon then convened a meeting himself, Henry Kissinger, Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff to Nixon, in which he talked about the need to get those documents in the Brookings Institution. And here were his words. I don't care what you have to do to get the documents. Firebomb the goddamn place. Break in. Do what you have to do, but get the documents. Kissinger absolutely silent. Haldeman, no retort. Another day or two later, he comes back to it. Did you come up with a plan to break into Brookings? The President of the United States.
But they never carried that
They will.
out as best we
They
could.
will.
All right, so that-
We'll never get out of this maze of the 5 wars of Watergate if we don't.
Why don't we identify
Yeah,
what they are?
we gotta keep going. So we got the war against the news media, the war against the anti-war movement. Then the plumbers and the break-in was the war against the Democrats.
It was, as Carl said, against the first war was against the anti-war movement. The second war was against the press. And this is the 17 wiretaps on White House aides, reporters. It's the plumbers that find.
Kissinger out there.
And so that was transferred during the election season 72, Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, to the Nixon campaign, and the war then was against the Democrats. This is the sabotage and espionage campaign. And then the fourth war was the war against the system of justice. This is the government. Let's pay people for their silence. And the fifth war is a very interesting one, and that was Nixon's war against history. To say, oh, Watergate was just a blip, it was a small thing. And he spent 20 years after he resigned until he died trying to steer the story away from criminality and his responsibility, but the tapes put a tire around him.
Let's go forward on this for 1 second. So here we are, 50 years later, we're 30 years old.
I want
Go
to
ahead.
cut that off for just a second, because before we leave the events of the early 1970s, which we're going to when we get to your point, I just want to focus for a second on the war against the Democrats, and the war on the justice system. So those were essentially what you were talking to Deep Throat about. Mark Felt, who Bob had met when Bob was in the Navy. And he wrote a good book called The Secret Man about the true story of Deep Throat. But Carl mentioned COINTELPRO, which was just a horrifying FBI program to spy on anybody who happened to be against the Vietnam War or in favor of the Civil Rights Movement. And the person who was supervising that horrible program, the person who was supervising the wiretapping of Martin Luther King was Deep Throat.
Exactly.
So talk a little bit about
this is one of
It's a good call, Walter.
the paradoxes of somebody, and it's very clear to us the ambivalence felt. He didn't like Nixon. He thought Nixon was abusing the FBI, if you can imagine that. But Felt was a Hooverman. And
We better explain for some people who Hoover was. Not a vacuum cleaner. Or yes, a vacuum cleaner. J. Edgar Hoover, for at least 12 people here, was, from its inception, the head of the FBI until he died some 50 years later.
And his death became a very important part of Watergate, because you talked about the motives of people who cooperate with the press and leakers. In Felt's case, it was partly that he got squeezed out bureaucratically after Hoover's death.
yeah, see, the chronology is very important here. Hoover died in May of '72. Felt actually had a press release drafted. Because he was the deputy, he was going to get the job. And then Nixon realized that this is not somebody I can control, so he put in somebody who had nothing to do with the FBI, Patrick Gray. And so part of Felt's motive is personal, grave disappointment in not getting the directorship of the FBI, which he felt he was entitled to. And the Nixon administration did abuse the FBI. And there's no question about that. And so you try to get your handle, which in The Secret Man I did, on his mixed, confusing, understandable but not forgivable motive.
So Mark Felt was no Hal Holbrook. I mean, he didn't really embody this spirit of wanting the truth out. He had this
About
very
Nixon, he wanted that.
but he had these more narrow motives. I wanted to just ask you about the spycraft part of it, though, because it's just sort of still such an amazing story. So when you wanted to talk to him, you would take a little red flag on a flower pot and move the flower pot on your balcony so that he could see that you wanted to talk to him. Was he driving past your P Street, Georgetown apartment every day to see whether you were moving the flower pot?
He would get
Woodward came to Georgetown later.
Where do you live?
around DuPont Circle. No, what later came out is there were FBI agents. See, that whole area is the embassy area of Washington, and the FBI spies on the embassies. So they had lookout posts all around. And he said if to the agents who did this, and there are agents who came forward from upstate New York saying, know, they worked for Felt on this, and they said, oh, when the flower pot's out, let me know, and that means we're gonna meet in the underground.
So his people knew when he was talking to you, or
I
suspected?
don't know. I mean, people, tried to kind of scope that out. I don't think they knew. I think those people who do FCI, Foreign Counterintelligence work for the FBI, and live in apartments all around it. They have lots of tasks. And they have lots of people who are sources in the embassy for that.
So how to explain, even in the secret man, you say you don't have an explanation, but what do you think is the way they would figure out how to get a copy of your New York Times, go to page A20 and draw a clock with 3 a.m., that's when we're going to meet in the underground garage over the bridge. How did they get to the New York Times?
Because it was in my apartment building right in the lobby. And
So some kind of agent would go in and grab your New York Times? Unbelievable.
so, but you've got to remember that the FBI is a paramilitary organization, and particularly
Counterintelligence,
Pardon?
especially the counterintelligence.
Yeah, and you do this, you do that. You read these stories about dead drops, and, Soviet spies, and putting documents in the tree trunk, and all of this. That's what these people do for a living.
So Carl, you on the fifth one, the War Against History, you were about to make a historical context point.
Well, as follows. So here we were writing about this massive campaign and these 5 wars, actually, of political espionage and sabotage. And we find 50 years later, both of us are working on Donald Trump reporting. And so we knew the 50th anniversary edition of All the President's Men that the publisher wanted to put a new edition out. We decided we would write a new introduction, and we enumerated very quickly what had happened in Watergate, and our belief at the time we had written the first edition of Watergate 50 years earlier, that never again would there be a president of the United States who had undertaken anything against the United States and its Constitution and the law, such as had happened in Watergate. And then we wrote in this beginning, and then came Donald Trump. And that is the transition to most of the introduction. I think the most important thing that we say about Trump in that introduction, and I remember when I first used the word on the air, that he is the first seditious president in the history of the United States, unless you were going to count Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So think about what it means to have a president of the United States who is seditious, to undermine the very country and its system of laws, its system of governance, with loyalty only to himself. And along came Donald Trump. And interestingly enough, on the 50th anniversary of Watergate, the two of us were on the air together, talking not just about Watergate, but about the January 6th hearings, which we were on the air about.
So drill
50 years
down
later.
a little bit into what makes Trump even worse than Nixon. We heard Nixon's ordering break-ins, he's doing some unbelievably horrible things before the Watergate break-in, and then continuing after. What makes Trump even worse?
2 things. First, his ability to understand the weak spot in American democracy. And we say in this new introduction that George Washington, first president of the United States, in his farewell address, warned of someone just like Trump. He warned in that address that
The office would be held by unprincipled men.
There you
I mean,
go.
here's George Washington in 1797, literally realizing that the concentration of power in the presidency is so great and the danger of unprincipled men holding it.
And that, Washington said, is the weak spot. We cannot defend against that. And every other president, with the exception, as far as I know, of Nixon and then Trump, they governed, no matter how badly, without that absolute absence of nothing but self-interest, which Trump,
Yes,
when
exactly.
Trump
I think
exemplifies.
we didn't carry, I'm thinking about this and living in the era of Trump still,
That's correct.
and it has not gone away. I think Trump has bamboozled us, the public
I
and reporters,
No.
and he's bamboozled us about this discussion of the 2020 election being stolen. Now, and people will write all the time, it's a lie, it's a lie. Yes, it's not, but it's even, there is zero evidence.
That's right.
And we have kind of adopted in a strange, bizarre way, which only a panel of psychiatrists in 10 years will be able to describe, have gone and accepted, let's have a discussion about the 2020 election. It's absurd. There is no
nothing.
evidence, nothing. And
So-
we
so
shouldn't
are you
say
talking-
it's a lie, we should just say, there's no evidence. I was talking to a bunch of lawyers the other day, a couple of hundred of them, and I said, any of you ever have a case where the other side had no evidence? And none of them raised their hands. So this is a case of no evidence. And what we have to do is, and you know, journalistically, there's people are uncharacteristically reluctant to use the word lie, and I understand, but it's used and it fits here. But we shouldn't enter the room to even have a discussion with him about this. And because he's running again, it's my experience in travels I've had around the country that his supporters in Texas, I asked 25 of them were questioning me after a speech, and going on, and I said, let me ask you a question. And this is in Midland, Texas, the oil capital of Texas, where both Bushes live. And these people are interrogating you. And I said, let me ask you a question. How many of you, 25, believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump? Raise your hand. How many people do you think?
I don't want to, it's too scary to guess.
No, go. How many?
These are young journalists.
No, these are not journalists. These are oil people.
The oil people, most of them.
No, zero.
So nobody believes
What?
it.
No, and so, what? Help me with this. You understand, how many of you are going to vote for Donald Trump in 2024? Raise your hand. How many?
Yeah.
All of them.
All that's divorce. See,
That's greed, right? Is it, how do you assess that?
I assess it, they don't believe it, but they like Trump, they like the tax cuts, they like the renegade spirit. They
like
They
the
have
hates
few-
Democrats.
I'd like to
have
have
few quality.
no more disappointed group this week than when the House Republicans actually elected a speaker, because the Trump supporters don't want things to work.
But they elected a speaker who is one of them.
Yes,
Yeah,
So
I
that-
just wanted to drill down on something that you said. You said bamboozled reporters too. So it seems to me the reporters know the truth. They haven't been bamboozled, but they've been cowed. So when Speaker Johnson was out yesterday and today, where was the Sam Donaldson to say, Speaker Johnson, how can you believe this nonsense
when there's
when
no
there's no
evidence.
evidence of it? And are you going to persist in making the argument that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, even though there's no evidence? And nobody said that to him. They just asked him other kinds of
When
questions.
Carl and I weren't there, we were taking a mental health care. But that, you know, there's something about it that really drives me to, why are we having a discussion of 2020? It's over.
Yeah.
It's over. In doing the third Trump book with Bob Costas, we got all the Giuliani memos about the
Hair
election.
dye, we got the hair dye memos.
Yeah, right. And big, thick stack of memos about all these things that were done. And one of them says in Wisconsin, 242,000 prisoners in Wisconsin voted on election day in 2020. Now, with 242,000, I remember reading about the big jailbreak in Wisconsin. There was none. So Costa and I go and look. And the first false part of that assertion is there were actually only 49,000 people incarcerated in Wisconsin. We talked to Wisconsin authorities. And they said, you know how many prisoners voted? 0. No.
So, I'm not going to ask, where things are going, because people are always asking us to make these dumb predictions. But based on your Watergate experience, do you think that we now have a flipping trend with Jenna Ellis flipping, or could this be a false dawn in the Trump case?
Well, I think there's no question about dominoes in terms of the case of Jenna Ellison in Georgia, because 6 or 10 more since she flipped have now flipped themselves. Look, you have 4.
Wait, 6 or 10 more since Jenna
I
Ellis?
believe that's right. No, I
Is
thought.
that a story from today?
Am I wrong? I thought that I saw that last night.
Maybe there
Maybe I'm
are
wrong.
rumors that they're hoping.
I think it's meaningless, because they already have, and if you look at that January 6th indictment, they have 13 people, including Pence, Cipollone, who was the most credible person.
It's counsel.
He was counsel to Trump in the White House, telling him there is no evidence that will change the election in any case. They have Bill Barr, who is the Attorney General. They have 10 other people who say they told Trump, not only is it not true, but they know it's not true. And so
So it's a willful blindness case.
so they, you know.
I don't know a prosecutor that doesn't think that the January 6th case is one of the great prosecutorial cases, both in terms of circumstantial evidence, which circumstantial evidence is really important, and testimony from those who witnessed it. It's an amazing case.
Let me go. I want to go to some audience questions here, and there's actually a few that ask a familiar but good question about what your views are in retrospect of Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon.
You'll be surprised, perhaps. And I was, when I heard of the pardon, I was in New York, and I heard it on the radio, and I called Woodward at home.
And I was asleep.
He was asleep. He was having a mental health break.
I was
And I said to him, have you heard the news? And he said, no, what? And I said, the son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch. And Woodward knew exactly what I meant. And for a long time, both of us believed that this was a terrible thing. That Nixon, no one is above the law, and for Nixon not to be prosecuted, obviated that principle. That indeed there was more information to be learned, and that Nixon should have been grilled on the stand, etc., etc. And eventually, I came, and so did Bob, I think, to believe that one of the great acts of political courage in the history of the United States was Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. And the reason is, think of this, think if something like this happened today. Ford knew that in granting that pardon, he was running against Jimmy Carter for the presidency of the United States. And he knew that if he pardoned Nixon, there was a very good chance that he was going to lose the election over this issue. And yet, he issued it, he said he needed his own presidency, but the country needed to move on from Watergate. And then a little while later, and I'll let Bob pick up the rest of the story.
I went and did 7 interviews with Ford 25 years later at his home, Rancho Mirage. And he finally asked, what happened with the pardon? And he said, I'm going to tell you, I've never told Eddie. And then Nixon's chief of staff came and said, if you pardon Nixon, he'll resign to get the presidency. And I thought there was a deal. And Ford made a passionate case. He said, and he literally put his hands like this and said, all my life I was down here thinking about Gerald Ford's political interests. And all of a sudden, I'm the President of the United States, and I'm up in here, and I'm looking down, and I'm saying, what does the country need? What is the national interest? And the national interest to get Nixon off the front page, get his tapes, which Ford did, which are the lasting legacy. And it was Caroline Kennedy who called and said, she and Teddy Kennedy, her uncle, are going to give Ford the profiles of courage to Ford, not for being president or a politician, but for the simple act of pardoning Nixon. And I remember watching that. I was not there. And what a cold shower for me, because in '74, I thought it was absolute corruption like Carlos. And then you submitted 25 years later to interrogation. And I talked to Ford's lawyers and his staff, and what we thought was corruption turned out to be the opposite.
But now it's kind of turning around again, and some people who had been against the pardon and for the pardon, and I include myself in this, are now saying, well, maybe it wasn't a good idea because it set a precedent of not holding the president accountable.
No, but you have to live in the moment that Ford was in 1974. He was being inundated. And when I interviewed him, he said his state of mind was, Nixon's dominating everything. And he said plaintively, I needed my own presidency, and the only way to do that was sweep the past away.
What do you think is the proper punishment for Donald Trump?
You want it to be like in a James Bond movie, or you want it to be? I think that anything that allows the country to move forward without him being the President of the United States is punishment. It's very interesting. Back at the time of Watergate, if you would have asked Woodward and me a question like that, we would have run to as down center, middle, I don't mean centrism, but we would have avoided the question. And I think one of the things that's happened in journalism since Watergate is that we finally opened up about who we are as people who are journalists, and we make judgments, hopefully based on repertorial considerations, but we're not some kind of robotic or automaton reporter dolls that have no feelings about these
Well, so
questions.
what you're saying is that truth, you were talking about truth earlier, and
The truth is,
questions here.
Donald Trump is not fit to be the president of the United States. Let someone come forth with some evidence that he is fit to be the president of the United States, and I'd be the first to put it out there and go on the air with it.
But just journalistically, and we have some questions here about, the crisis in local journalism and journalism more broadly, the challenges. Did we get to a place where the hierarchy of values got skewed maybe by, Fox saying, fair and balanced? As if balance is number one instead of truth being number one and the best attainable facts being number two, and balance being...
If I may, because I think there's an important element in all of this that we need to think about. And it has to do with reporter's method and the investigator's method. The great British novelist Graham Greene said at one point, said, "Don't despise your enemies. Don't despise the people who were on the other side. They have a case. You need to listen to it. You need to understand it. You need to be patient with it. You don't have to agree, but you have to look and absorb the counter arguments." And Carl taught me this about the importance of listening. I've go through transcripts of my own interviews, and my wife Elsa said, "You talk too much," which is true. And so I've developed a little technique of taking this finger and putting it over my little finger and jamming it into the fingernail so it hurts. And it's a memory aid to tell me to shut the F up.
I'm going to do that. That's so great. I'm going to do that because it's in the silent spaces that people tell you shit.
Yes,
When you're not talking.
or even the truth.
Yeah.
The Woodward theory of masochism reporting. But it's a really great question. Bring the evidence of Trump and his fitness. I'd be the first to report it. Let's see the evidence of it. It's all about getting the evidence. That's what reporting is. That's what the best obtainable version of the truth is. And back to the idea, but it is not neutral.
Right. So I'm afraid that we have come to the point in the evening where we need to say goodnight. But before we do, there were a couple of questions about Carl's experience in New Jersey, which he recounts some in his terrific recent book, Chasing History. But tell him an Elizabeth, New Jersey story before we go.
Well, I loved reporting here. I thought, I came from one of the greatest newspapers in the United States, the Washington Star, the afternoon paper in Washington, where I had gone to work as a 16-year-old. I was lucky enough to get a job when I was in high school. I had 1 foot in the juvenile court, 1 foot in the pool hall, a toe in the classroom, and I got this amazing job because I could type fast and I had taken typing with the girls. And my 5 years at the Star in the capital of the United States, when I was allowed to do almost every kind of reporting, I mean, the first week that I went to work there, I was sent by an editor to my high school to cover Jack Kennedy giving a speech at my high school. And I was covering the crowd. I mean, everything you can imagine, I got the opportunity. The Star wanted me to finish college if I was going to stay on as a reporter at Start College, actually. Well, I'm a dropout. That's the start college. And whatever the case, one of my favorite editors at the Star became the editor of the Elizabeth Journal and said, why don't you come up here with me? I'll let you do anything you want. You can write a column, which I did, cover anything you want. And here's probably my favorite thing that happened. I'd been in Elizabeth, which I knew nothing about. I'd never seen the place when I arrived. It was gritty. And second week I go out and the editor of the paper says, go have lunch with the mayor. He has a weekly lunch with a bunch of local characters. You really, you gotta learn about this town. Go there and have lunch. I go down to a place called Christine Lee's Chinese restaurant. Is there anybody here that remember Christine Lee? And she was great, Christine Lee. She held this kind of forum. It was amazing. So I go and I meet the mayor, Tom Dunn. How many people here remember Tom Dunn? He's the longest serving mayor in the history of the United States, maybe. He was the mayor for like 40 years, something like that. So Tom Dunn is here, and he sits me next to him so I can be properly introduced to the other people, especially the guy to his right, who is Tony Provenzano. Whoever doesn't know who Tony Provenzano is, now you
He
know the
plays
difference.
second base for the Yankees.
And Tony Provenzano, who later, of course, is widely believed to be the man who killed or had Jimmy Hoffa killed. He controlled the docks down in Port Newark and throughout this part of the world. A local Chevrolet dealer, the Archbishop of, no, he was not Chevrolet dealer. The Archbishop of the diocese, which was the diocese of Elizabeth in those days. The town was about 98% Catholic population, the highest percentage of Catholics of any diocese in the country. And the police chief, and the owner of the bowling alley, who was on the take at the paper. I kept saying to myself, why are there so many stories in the sports section about bowling? And as great as my editor was, and as good as my instincts were, we couldn't quite bring this paper around to maybe what we thought it ought to be. But we did some really terrific reporting. I happily won a bunch of prizes for my reporting, and on the strength of that and my experience at the Star, I got hired at the Washington Post when I was 22.
Just to roll this out of Elizabeth for 1 or 2 minutes. It's a great town and great experience, and it taught you.
And the Singer Sewing Machine Company was there.
And that is to deal with Nixon and Trump and think about this. The similarity is stunning. And after Nixon resigned, Senator Ervin headed the Ervin Committee, the Watergate Committee, that really was the gold standard. And they got testimony from everyone in the case. Ervin, in a final report he did himself, asked the question, why did this happen? And his answer fits Nixon and Donald Trump. And his answer was, why Watergate? A lust for political power. And we know about lust. And if you look at the Nixon tapes, you study the last 7 years, 4 books, it's a lust, it's a drive for having his way. And that's something for us to think about when the politicians come down the line. And do they have this safety net? Yes, the win. It's a disease.
So Sam Irvin, I think we can close with this. He said, I believe in those same remarks, when asked to describe specifically what Watergate was, he said it was, quote, a brazen and daring assault led by Nixon himself against the Constitution and the rule of law. And that's what Donald Trump is continuing to try to do, and that's why the stakes in the 2024 election are nothing less than democracy itself. And I'm sorry to end on that sober note, but I hope instead of just covering the horse race, any reporter who is attempting to cover this campaign also covers the stakes that I think both Carl and Bob have laid out.
It's important that you say that truth. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me add one thing that I think, thinking of these students here in the front row. I was lucky enough at the Washington Star and the Washington Post to work with two great reporters, Haynes Johnson and David Broder. They both started at the Star and then went over to the Post. And every 4 years, they would take 6 months and between them divide up the country and go out and talk to people in the country. And from this came these incredible stories about what was on the minds of the people of the country. You just mentioned the horse race. Before you get to the horse race, it's really helpful to know what are the people of the country thinking? What are they doing? How are they living? What are their relationships with the economy? What do they think of their mayor? What do they think is happening in their town? We get very, very little of that. And that's as valid a form of reporting as what Bob and I have done all these years. But I think that we need to start to consolidate this idea that politics and journalism are not separate from the rest of American culture. And that we also need to be reporting on what people in this country, we want to know about the phenomenon of, quote, Trumpism. We're not going to find out just following Donald Trump around. So I just want to end that as well, that we have a larger canvas that we need to start covering. Why is it that Fox News has been able to do what it has? We need to talk to the people of the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you.